I am Emmeline Church. I was one of the first residents on Liberty Street.
I am Sophia Fellows. I came here with my husband Henry in the year 1813.
We early Americans believed that the grave was familiar as the cradle, and that death was natural and inevitable.
The Victorians had an extreme fascination with death. Death was such a way of life in the 1800s, what with inadequate housing conditions, poor sanitation, cholera, and typhoid, a child was lucky if it saw its first birthday. And not only in the cities, even in small towns like Penfield.
No surprising then, when death spilled over into the lives of the living with such frequency that certain protocols had to be employed in dealing with it. Rules and superstitions had to be made to make sure it was dealt with in an acceptable way.
They weren't just deceased, these people. Oh no, they were passing over into the other side, entering into rest, going to meet their maker. A good death began while the person was still alive. Everyone gathered around the deathbed of the suffering person, balanced precariously between this life and the next, listening intently and waiting to be given advice, maybe amendments to a will, but especially to hear his last words, which were, theoretically, some profound statement communicated from a higher realm.
There was so much to do in these early years that there was almost no time to be distressed. Attention to detail is of the utmost importance when a loved one has died. The manner in which one prepares for a funeral is critical in the social structure of our time. The laying out of the body could have been done by any number of people, from the undertaker to the local midwife, the spouse to the servants. But for it to be done in the proper way, it had to be done in absolute silence, with no one present but those actively involved in the procedure.
Immediately after death, the eyelids would be closed and covered with cotton wool, or in some cases, coins. This was to prevent the deceased from being able to choose someone to accompany him to the grave. It was crucial that the spirits who had come to claim the dead did not attach themselves to any of the living. Next, windows and doors were opened to allow the spirit to pass freely from this world. All mirrors in the house would be covered by black crepe material in order that the soul of the departed would not get trapped behind the glass and be prevented from passing to the other side.
It was also said that if you saw your own reflection in the room where someone had just died, then you too would soon die yourself. If there was a clock in the room where death had taken place, then this would be stopped at the exact moment of death, or the household would have bad luck. When someone dies, it means the time stood still for them. For the living to allow time to continue was inviting the spirit of the deceased to remain. But by actually stopping time, this would allow the spirit to move on.
Family photographs were also turned face down to prevent any of the close relatives and friends of the deceased from being possessed by the dead. Black was the appropriate funeral attire. The custom of wearing black is ancient. It is believed that spirits, some of them ill-willed, will linger around the newly deceased corpse. Black will of course confuse the spirits into thinking that one is but a shadow and not a living person to whom they can possess. As the body would be kept at home until the funeral, the curtains would now be closed, candles would be lit as a sign of respect, and the 24-hour vigil would now begin. This was to prevent any chance of the body being buried alive, which, in Victorian times, was a major concern, and there are many patented inventions created at this time to thwart this eventuality, including coffins fitted up with bells or glass windows, even tongue-pulling devices.
During this time, a loved one could take the opportunity to obtain a lock of hair from the deceased or keep as a keepsake, and maybe place it in a locker or a brooch. And this would be considered a suitable item of jewelry to be worn during mourning. As photography was a relatively new invention in the mid-1800s, it was not unusual for the Victorians to dress up the deceased and have them photographed in family portraits along with living family members.
Many photographs survive today of babies and children in such poses, propped up and surrounded by toys to give them a more realistic feel. But in most cases, the deceased was usually portrayed as sleeping peacefully. Although this Victorian post-mortem photography is considered morbid in today's modern world, where images of loved ones are collected at every turn, this must surely have been a precious comfort to the bereaved at the time, providing them with one last memory to cling on to. A funeral wreath of laurel, yew, or boxwood, tied with crepe or black ribbons, was hung on the front door to alert passerby that a death had occurred. When it was time to leave for the burial, the deceased was carried out of the house feet first in order to prevent his spirit from looking back into the house and beckoning another member of the family to follow him. Here, in the graveyard, his head was laid to rest in the west and his feet to the east. This was necessary to ensure the soul be able to meet the Lord when the sun woke up and be able to walk into the heavenly pastures beyond.
These superstitions may be silly to the modern mind, but they were important customs in my day and helped the people in mourning accept and cope with the distressing circumstances surrounding death.
You have met some other spirits along your journey who have shared other superstitions to educate you in your time of need. Listen and take note if you are wise, or heed their advice and beware.
Good night.
The body snatchers, they have come and made a swipe at me. It's very hard, them kind of men won't let a body be. Today, the thought of taking a body from its freshly dug grave seems not only grotesque, but irrational. In fact, to dig a body from its grave at the time was illegal, and frankly, there was no textbooks or anatomical charts to work from. So, the need for bodies was obviously rising. In Victorian thought, since it was illegal, and bodies were to be kept from heaven should they have been dug up, they obviously discouraged this attitude. Now, the body snatchers of the 1800s were actually students and doctors of medicine, and the growing need for cadavers arose as the advances in medicines were coming up. To actually dig a body and to be in part of a grave, well, frankly, to be previously dead was almost as dangerous as being alive. See, the Victorians had kept us from getting the bodies, and they made it illegal, so we had to hire and devise new tactics. We simply hired resurrectionists who would then take the bodies from the graves, and then they would bring the gold to us. Our adventures were so legend that there were many literary works written upon our adventures and basically the travails to get the gold. Resurrectionists would then dig up the bodies under the cover of moonlight. Digging through 6 feet of dirt was actually pretty difficult and frankly quite conspicuous. So, resurrectionists would then tunnel through the ground, poke out a piece of the coffin, and then pull out the body with a rope. Now, there was obviously a solution to this, so there would then be boards bolted to the insides of the coffins and metal collar stays fashioned around the necks. This would keep the bodies safe in their grave and safe in their place in heaven. This is only the beginning of the war on the grave robbers. Had you been from a more affluent family, there were iron gates that were rigged around, and then there were big stone houses erected to keep your deceased loved ones from the living. These iron buildings would then be patrolled by armed guards to keep the bodies safe until they were no longer of use to science. The bodies could then be buried in a grave properly. Now, eventually, the attitude on this changed from the Victorians, and they passed laws which would allow the bodies of the unclaimed and then the bodies of those that wanted to be donors to give their bodies over to science. There are no actual recorded grave robbings here at Oakwood Cemetery. However, interesting to note, there may have been structures erected to keep the dead, frankly, from the living. If you look upon my grave, there I will not be. They haven't left an atom there of my anatomy.
Hello, my name is Grace. I live with many cats, and I brought my talking cat to meet people tonight. Her name is Fluffy. She's gone to sleep, so she can't talk to you now. Good night.